Test. Okay. Hi, everyone. And hi, everyone online. Can you all let me know if you can hear me okay? Yes, awesome. Thanks. Okay, so I know we have a few people who are not present today online and in person, but that's okay. The plan is to finish off this set of slides and then move on to the chapter on agency and free will, which I doubt we'll finish, but that's fine. So we were talking about strange loops, right? Kind of inspired by this sort of thing, like video feedback. And this is an example of something that Douglas Hofstadter, he's a cognitive scientist and a mathematician, was fascinated with when he was a little guy. And he thinks of consciousness as a bit like one of these strange loops, like a video feedback loop or a tangled hierarchy in mathematics. So ourselves on this view are these, as is quoted here, these paradoxical level crossing feedback loops, right? And the brain is full of these tangled hierarchies. But what does that mean, right? We started to get to this stuff last time. Consciousness arises, Hofstadter thinks, from these many dancing symbols sort of looking at themselves. So there's no self in the brain. There's no central sort of observer, right? No Cartesian materialism here. There's no place where it comes together in no special place or time, that is. Rather, it's different brain processes looking at other brain processes. And if we're situated at the right level of all of these strange loops, we can talk about there being an I. If we move too far away, poof, it's gone. But how do we deal with subjectivity? Because remember, that's the problem, right? That's the hard problem, according to Chalmers. How do we explain how, whatever the brain is doing, it's implementing some kind of physical processes, whether it's a language of thought or strange loops or something. How does that explain subjective experience? Right. Well, I'm paraphrasing Blackmore at the bottom, but how could these dancing symbols observing one another explain the redness of red, or indeed any other kind of qualia, right? Or kinds of qualia, I should say. It doesn't really do much for us when it comes to the hard problem. Metzinger has a representationalist view of the self, that the self is something that I suppose you could say is maybe like a distributed sort of representation that is represented to other systems in the brain. That's sort of like what Hofstadter is arguing for here as well. And he describes this phenomenal self model, which we could call the PSM. What is the PSM? It's a distinct and coherent pattern of neural activity that allows you to integrate parts of the world into an inner image of yourself as a whole. So an inner image of yourself, that is what makes this a representationalist theory. We're talking mental representations here, right? So on this view, we get kind of a virtual reality generated by the brain. It's not as rich as what reality is really like because of how our sensory systems are designed and stuff like that. But it's like a virtual world that our brain builds for us. I kind of like this idea. Yeah. And it sounds a little Kantian in a sense, maybe just a bit, not transcendentally so, but there's that, what's the world really like kind of question, right?
That kind of, I mean, that idea does line up with the idea that like people's perception of reality like, differs in a like subjective manner.
Yeah.
Like stemming from the fact that, you know, like no one's perception of reality is ever complete. And like, I don't know, it definitely makes sense to me because you see that kind of thing in other like areas, especially like I'm an artist, so I'm thinking about like making like visual arts, right? There are things you do depending on what you're making, where you're kind of pulling what you're making away from what would be the most realistic to achieve a specific effect.
Right.
One good example would be if you are making things that are supposed to appear as like a thumbnail, like a small image, and there's like, let's say you have like cartoon characters, right? If you're drawing specifically for that, like sort of shrunken down thumbnail, you want to exaggerate certain parts of what you're drawing because the way the brain perceives detail changes depending on scale.
Right, exactly. So this is kind of maybe like brain as artist, right?
I also like the tunnel, like imagery.
Yeah, the tunnel through reality.
Everybody does have kind of like a tunnel. Reality does kind of seem like a tunnel where like it has a focus, but you know that something exists outside of that focus.
Yeah. It's almost as if the world is some kind of anthill.
Yeah.
That's how I like to think of it. The world is an anthill and we're the ants tunneling through it. I think there's still something to be said for like you could make an argument that there is probably something that's quite common between people's experiences at the same time, right? I mean, we know that brains, like you were saying a moment ago, process certain things a certain way,
yeah.
Right?
And you can see that with like some of the optical illusion stuff that we did like a few weeks ago, where it's like the way your brain perceives a set of information will change depending on its context.
Yeah, like, well, there's plenty of examples, but
one that came up in a piece I was working on last week actually. Let's say you have like a canvas, right, and split in half, and in the middle of each half is a circle, and inside the circle is the same shade of gray. But on one half of the page outside the circle, you have a color that is lighter than that shade of gray.
Yeah.
And the other half, you have a color that's darker, and the two circles will appear to be different.
yeah, that's similar to, I think I can't remember the name of the illusion, but I know the one you're talking about. There's a very famous one with shadows that sort of accomplishes that effect, like an image of a figure casting a shadow. But yeah, and we can know what each other's talking about here because, you know, our brains all kind of evolved to be the same sort of brain. I mean, our brains aren't wired up differently, but or our brains are wired up differently, but fundamentally, I think it's the same bit of machinery. So, but then again, we're also always kind of situated in our own little perspective too. So it's an extra layer to the problem of subjectivity, I suppose. What about pearls on a string? We haven't talked about that yet. This is from Galen Strawson, and he calls this the pearl view of the self. This kind of reminds me a little bit of William James's idea of the thought, and thought itself is the thinker, right? But he calls it, Strawson that is, calls this the pearl view, quote, because it suggests that many mental selves exist, one at a time and one after another, like pearls on a string. And the pearls here are understood to be particular patterns of neural activity. So thoughts, I guess, if you're like an identity theorist or something, right? If you think that brain states are mental states, then these patterns of neural activity are thoughts, representations, something of that nature. And he describes selves as these Psms, he calls them, subjects of experience that are single mental things. So there's a lot of silly anagrams in. Yeah, I know. I was talking about GoFi in my other class. GoFi is good old fashioned AI.
No.
Yeah, I know. Just say AI.
Leave the stupid and needlessly complicated anagram for bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's silly. So we'll just say subjects of experience. How about that? Subjects of experience and their single mental things. So, you know, this is definitely kind of a bundle theory, not a bundle, but a, you know, but a string with lots of stuff on it, sort of bundly, sort of loopy. So the pearls kind of come one after another. And this is why I draw the connection between this and William James, right? Because you have the thought itself is the thinker. So the thought is the owner of what was thought before and what's going on now, but it's going to pass that to another thought, you know, like a shepherd switching shifts with another shepherd with his flock of sheep, right? But Strawson also doesn't think that we don't need any agency, any personality. The self doesn't really have those things. Those things are illusory because it's all pearls on a string, right? And also, of course, there's no long-term continuity of the self, really. It's not unified and continuous, but it seems to be because it's one pearl after another on the string.
What is the string?
I think the string is like space and time or something.
But like that relies on space and time, that like events are linear.
Well, it depends. It depends who you talk to, right?
Because like it's still like, you know, so are the pearls tied together? You know what I mean? And even if they're tied together, they're not together.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Maybe this is why I say time, right? Because it's one after another. It's their proximity to one another in time and in similarity. Like, again, like animation, right?
Like the only one that really relies on like sequence of one pearl after another.
Well, we're inevitably moving forward in time
Yeah.
all the time.
Well, I mean, I think part of this is just that is like, it's an attempt of explaining it, like, you know, why, if bundle theory is like, if bundle theory is what's actually going on, why it feels like this sort of like continuous.
Right,
Like, it's trying to
exactly.
come up with an explanation that the theory itself doesn't really address.
Yeah. So you might have, like, maybe I have a self, maybe I'm having a particularly strong moment of self-awareness. Maybe when I get up in the morning, my alarm's going off and I think, oh, I've got to get up and get ready for class. So I'm thinking, I have to do this, I have to do that. And I'm having all these thoughts. But then as I take the bus, I start to maybe daydream, to slip off into, you know, inattention, and maybe myself kind of falls away a little bit until the bus pulls up to the university and I've got to get off. And I hear that ding, and then whoop, I'm like fully self-aware again. That could be a different pearl on the string. It depends how you want to divide it up, of course, but you know, the pearls on a string is just meant to be a metaphor or an illustration, right?
The way I kind of think about it is our sort of like observation of experience that like the self is continuous, regardless of whether it is or isn't, is itself like tied to sort of space-time in terms of that progression.
Yeah.
So this is just trying to bridge that gap where it doesn't really explanation.
Yeah. And maybe we could explain like dissociative identity disorder or something, you know, maybe the string is cut and the pearls are just jumbling around.
That's
No.
actually another thing though, because like algebra and algebra for that, because you have two different cells in one string.
Well, yeah, maybe you have two strings or no strings. I mean, there are limits to any analogy, right?
Yeah.
So, but I kind of like this. It reminds me of the thought stuff. It reminds me of the animation analogy that I offered last time, where we have something that seems unified and continuous, right? But it's just the succession of one thing after another that makes it seem
I
continuous.
prefer the skinny case of all the bingo games.
Oh, yeah. It seems like a, well, that's actually pretty interesting, right? Yeah. Anyway, so this is like pretty extreme bundle theory right here. More extreme than the others that we looked at, like Damasio's, like James's for sure. But all of them, which this is what makes them bundle theory, denies the existence of a unified continuous self. As Dennett says, good old Dennett, if you leave the subject in your theory, the subject, the me, the I, the ego, you have not yet begun. A good theory of consciousness should make a conscious mind look like an abandoned factory because there's nobody in there, right? Cartesian materialism, that's what Dennett's always trying to avoid. But it still seems like the factory is not abandoned. And that's what we have to explain. So, in this respect, I think Dennett's approach is a little bit like James's. In that, James is saying, okay, I don't think there's an ego, there's a unified continuous self, but we need to explain why it seems that there is. And that's also very much what Dennett wants to do. So Dennett, again, there's no ghost in the machine, to quote his advisor, Gilbert Ryle. There's no ghost in the machine. The self is more like this narrative center of gravity that we were kind of gesturing toward during our last lecture, right? So, okay, that's it for loops, tunnels, and pearls on a string. Any lingering questions about any of that stuff before we move on to talk about agency and free will? All right. Now, this stuff here is quite interesting and quite unnerving. If memory serves, this is where we will talk about, what's wrong week? Doesn't matter. We will talk about freedom of the will, whether we have it, whether we don't, what the neuroscientific evidence is on the matter.
Anyone with ADHD can tell you that free will is an illusion.
Yeah, maybe, but remember, of course, illusions aren't necessarily things that don't exist. They're things that are not the way we think they are. And I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but this is like some pretty neat, this is just some pretty cool stuff we're about to talk about. So get ready. Okay, coffee. So this is actually one of those really old questions. A lot of questions in philosophy are old, which is maybe why, as we discussed last time, certain scientists are like, why bother with those? We've been asking them forever. Will we ever solve them? One of those questions is a question concerning freedom of the will, namely whether we have it or not. And this question has kind of had various incarnations throughout the years, right? In the Middle Ages, like in scholastic philosophy, it was related to theology, right? So, God knows everything, right? He's omniscient. He knows everything that's supposed to happen. So he knew that Eve was going to eat the apple. So it's kind of like he allowed the fall of human beings in the Garden of Eden. That's something that medieval philosophers would talk about a lot. How could God allow this to happen? If he knows everything, it means he let it happen, which means the original sin, he knew it. So he knows what's going to happen. How are we free? Right? Or nowadays, it's more of a more related to physics and metaphysics, right? Determinism and free will. Are we determined in the sense that, our biology, our body chemistry, all of that stuff, is that what makes us tick? Are we determined by our upbringing, right? Nature versus nurture. These are questions that are a bit more modern, a little bit less scholastic and theological. Basically, it's related to two problems, though, throughout philosophy. If you look at questions around freedom of the will, one issue is determinism, which is maybe the more modern line of questioning. If the universe is determined, that is, if everything is a result of cause and effect, and everything works according to these very deterministic laws of physics, how can we be free? This is kind of the thing that, we might ask if we were learning, taking a physics class or something, right? all this stuff in nature is subject to laws of nature, and I'm made of all that stuff. I'm mostly made out of water, right? I've got some carbon, I got some iron, I got a bunch of elements, chemicals and elements that make me up, that are subject to the laws of physics. So I seem to be subject to these deterministic laws. So how am I free? And getting, closer to the older sort of medieval philosophy, if we're determined, how can we be morally responsible for our actions, right? In the Genesis account, God kicks Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden because Eve and then Adam ate the fruit of knowledge. But if God knows everything, he already knew that was going to happen. So is Eve really responsible for tempting Adam and getting him to eat that yummy apple?
I think.
Oh, no, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I really think I think there's kind of idea of like the inherent value of human beings. So I don't think there's any actually evidence for moral responsibility or inherent value, but we should just, sort of use both of them to create the society that we want.
Yeah. But how do we justify that? Like, okay, we want a certain society, but I mean, then it sounds like it's just based on a whim. And our whims could be determined. Oh, what do we do then, right? So, yeah.
I think the second question, especially also brushes on kind of like the one big theological paradox that like God, the way he's presented, is not to be like, all good, all knowing, all powerful simultaneously.
Yeah.
Where, like you could eliminate one of those things and it works, but you can't have all three.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what this is.
Yeah, which is from the nature of things. What was that? Epicurus, I believe. Epicurus, like, he wrote a poem called The Nature of Things, where he says basically that, like, is God willing but not able to prevent evil? It's a poem about the problem of evil. If he's willing and able to, or willing but unable, then he's not all powerful. If he's able but not willing, then God is evil, right? So, and if neither, then he's not God. So yeah, fun stuff. Let's talk about determinism in a little bit more detail, though. This is the, as I sort of led into this a moment ago, it's the idea that the universe works according to these causal relationships. Scientists call them laws of nature or causal laws. Some examples of this would include, your typical examples like Newtonian physics, right? Like Newton's laws of motion. Or relativity theory is good too. Not quantum theory, though. We'll see why in a minute. Also, there's this difference that we need to kind of take note of and be aware of, and that's the difference between predictability and determinism. It's possible that we could live in a determined universe and not be able to predict what's going on because it's too complicated. Yeah.
I was thinking about that, like on the other side, like the example of like rolling dice, right? Like theoretically, right, you could predict exactly what it's going to be if you factored in every single source of what affects the die.
Yeah.
But it's too complicated for us to comprehend. There are too many minute things that all factor into that one action that to us it's new.
Exactly. I'm not sure if I mentioned this later in these slides, but there's an interesting way of thinking about this. It's called Laplace's demon. So it's Pierre Simon de Laplace, who was a physicist. He famously told Napoleon Bonaparte was reading his book, and he had the chance to ask Laplace, like, because Laplace was an atheist. He said, "Why didn't you talk about God in your physics?" And Laplace said, "I had no need of that hypothesis, because everything's determined according to Laplace." So he's saying, okay, check this out. Imagine you had a being with perfect knowledge of what everything in the universe is doing, every particle in the universe. and also had the ability to, work out probabilities of stuff happening. That being, which we call Laplace's demon, would be able to tell you everything, you'd be doing, say, 1 year from now at this exact time, or 20 years in the future. Or if it knew the initial starting conditions of the universe, it'd be able to tell you what you're doing now 14 billion years later, or whenever it is, right? Basically, Laplace's demon has godlike knowledge. Now, that illustrates determinism, but as you said, we're not Laplace's demon. And predictability is not the same as determinism. So, if it's something like dice rolls or something even more complicated, yes, in theory, we know, we know that that process is determined by causal laws. And in theory, we could work out exactly what's going to happen, but in practice, we probably couldn't. Then again, there are some laws that are maybe a bit more probabilistic. So quantum physics is like this. Quantum physics is kind of fuzzy. There's a little bit of randomness in quantum physics. For example, there's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? The Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is named after Werner Heisenberg, says that you can only know if out of two variables for any particle, you can only measure one of them at the same time, right? So say you're looking at some photons or some electrons, you could know those particles' position, but maybe not where they're going or how fast. Or you could know their spin, but not their position. And that's just a fact of the theory that when we observe things that are that small, we affect them in such a way that we can only know things about them within a certain degree of probability, right? Yeah.
Like I said in the previous talk, I have a friend who's studying that right now at Georgia Tech. And he said that's one of the biggest things that people get confused about quantum physics with, that it's unlike other areas of physics where you're usually trying to find a definite result.
Yeah.
The best you can do in quantum physics is the probability of it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's fine. It's just that there are limits to what we can know about the things we're studying. And people misunderstand this, right? There's a lot of quantum woo-woo out there. I'm sure your friend has heard about it, right? Like the double slit experiment. It's a cool experiment. It's the one where they're shooting electrons or whatever through the holes, right? And depending on whether it's observed or not, it makes one of two patterns. It'll make the wave interference pattern or just the double pattern. And people say all kinds of weird stuff about this, like, oh, it's the consciousness of the observer. Woo, it's weird. Like, I'm not trying to make a straw man out of this stuff, but they really do say strange stuff like that. When really, it's probably just to do with, the tools we have to measure these things. If you want to observe something, you have to affect it somehow, right? So it's inevitable that by observing and not observing, you're going to get weird stuff happening, right? So anyway.
I just want to ask, so one of them is probabilistic, but do you think it's probabilistic or do you think you just don't know?
Well, I don't know. I think that maybe we have to wait and see if how we unify, say, quantum physics with relativity theory, right? Because quantum mechanics works really great for subatomic stuff, and relativity theory works good for huge cosmic scale stuff, right? Yeah.
Going back to the dice roll idea, right? You have that sort of you have the probability of getting any given number, right, for a roll die, and that is that you can't really know what you're going. I mean, obviously theoretically you could, but
yeah,
outside the scope of human ability. But the more rolls you get, the numbers overall start to fall into this pattern that you can predict.
Yeah.
And so I kind of see this, I almost like, I obviously, this is me not knowing anything about physics, but I kind of see the same pattern almost happening with, you have on the smallest scale possible, you have probability. And as you scale up, you start to be able to work with actual like tangible numbers.
Yeah, I mean, even with very large data sets, though, sometimes it gets harder the more
Yeah.
information you
I
have.
obviously I'm not saying it's not like a one-to-one progression, but.
Yeah.
there's, like,
But overall patterns should emerge
Yeah.
when you have enough and you can take a step back. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
It's kind of, you can see the same thing with like people, where people are like, individuals who act in different ways, but if you look at a population, big enough patterns will emerge.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's true. But just patterns. Anyway, to get back to what I was saying a moment ago, yeah, it depends on questions of scale, like how far or close you're zoomed out, but also like paradigmatically, right? These are two very different enterprises, and we'll have to wait and see. Maybe we unify these two with, I don't know, quantum gravity is one, string theory is one, right? Maybe it depends how we make these things make sense together. And then we'll know, is it just our theoretical tools, or is it really the universe that's unpredictable, right? Anyway, we might live in a deterministic universe, sure, but maybe we're still free, right? Remember, these are all metaphysical positions. Determinism, metaphysically speaking, means that I cannot be the cause of my own actions. I cannot be said to have free will because I'm completely determined by causal laws, by my upbringing, by my genes, right? I'm completely determined. There's another view that's kind of like the opposite, called libertarianism. Not like political libertarianism, all those guys, they're an interesting bunch, right? We'll just say that. The political libertarians. But a metaphysical libertarian is somebody who believes that free will literally trumps the causal determinism. Like metaphysically speaking, it's like, okay, yeah, I'm subject to the laws of physics, but my free will can trump that. I can always decide. I always have a choice, which you can reduce to absurdity pretty quickly.
I've decided I'm not going to participate in gravity anymore.
Yeah, right. Like, where's the line that what kind of causal laws of the universe can free will override, and what kinds can it not? Like, do you just get up one day, if you're like a heroin addict, and go, you know what? I'm not going to be addicted to heroin anymore, right? If only that were the case. Think of the suffering that would not have to happen on this planet, right? But it does, right? People get addicted to substances. People get addicted to video games, for goodness sake, right? So is libertarian free will really possible? I don't know. I'm pretty skeptical about that. But I do think that maybe we can still be said to be free in a certain sense. Yes.
I think it might be like degrees of action, just like in kind of the same way, going back to what we talked about earlier, where like even in instances where patterns and predictability emerge, you still have outliers. It's kind of like a similar level of complexity with decision making.
Yeah.
You can make decisions, but in that decision making, there's always going to be like there's a spectrum of things you have like control over and things you have no control over, and everything in between.
Yeah. So there's going to be some things, some ways in which we are definitely determined, but there might be a little wiggle room in other things, and that's what compatibilism is about, right? Compatibilism is the view that free will is compatible with determinism, right? And that's a good thing, because that means we could have moral responsibility, right? Because remember, the problem is, if like determinists or non-compatibilists say, even libertarians say this, if your behavior is determined, then you can't be held responsible for what you do wrong, right? Legally or morally. Think about it. If I make you do something bad by coercing you to do it, are you really responsible? Like if you had no choice because I said, you have to do this thing or I'll kill you and I'll kill your family, right? You would probably do the thing. Well, maybe it depends. Maybe you wouldn't. If it was too evil, maybe you'd refuse and just say, no, kill me. I suppose, right? That's possible too. But just for example's sake, if you're determined in that way, you can't be held responsible for what you do wrong, nor can you be praised for what you do right. Because the decision, well, there is no decision. There's no decision that originated within you to, do the good or bad behavior, right? So as we want moral responsibility, right? Don't we? You don't? Like, but if somebody does, I mean, think about it. If somebody does something terrible to you, you want justice, right? And maybe, there are some edgy people out there going like, yeah, man, we're completely determined.
If we get rid of moral responsibility, upsides, embezzlement is legal, downsides not.
Yeah, right? Like, there are probably some nihilists out there who are like, I don't care about anything. Nothing matters. Moral responsibility is not real. I'm just going to do whatever I want. But if somebody did something horrible to them, they would probably be upset about it. I assume, right?
Maybe initially, and then in retrospect, why was I so upset about that? Nothing matters.
Maybe. I mean, who's seen The Big Lebowski?
That's why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can even not say Lebowski. Not say it. Like, so they come in and ruin his rug, right? Yeah. And dude just wants his rug back, and then it kicks off on this whole adventure. And their whole shtick is like, we don't care, we're nihilists. But then at the end of the movie, when all their money falls out of the bag and blows away, and they're having that big fight, all of a sudden they care. And John Goodman's character is like, oh, some effing nihilists, like, making fun of them. So that's what I'm saying. Like, no matter how nihilistic you say you are, there are probably some things you do care about. And one of those might be for those that have wronged you to have justice done to them, maybe, right?
To be honest, true nihilism is kind of pointless.
Well, if you're a true nihilist, everything's pointless, including your own nihilism, right? So that's great. So
That's how you can tell it's not, the best. It ends in a logical paradigm.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. But look, we want like maybe like the compatibilists to say that we're free in the sense that we could have always acted otherwise, or we're free in the sense that we're not coerced, right? Then we could still hold people morally responsible for their actions. And this is kind of the understanding of freedom that we have in like different legal traditions, like here in Canada, if I'm coerced into doing something, the law will view me as having been coerced if everything is done justly, right? I'm determined in the sense that obviously I need to eat food and drink water and sleep and do all that stuff. But I'm free in the sense that I can always decide not to do something. I could always will that I would have done otherwise, I guess, right? But anyway, we can't settle this debate here. This is one of the oldest debates in philosophy, after all. But if free will does exist, there has to be a way to explain it. It cannot just be magic, right? So we have a couple of options. Maybe free will is an illusion, which maybe implies determinism, or there's free will, but there's a natural explanation for why we have it. And there's a connection between free will, agency, and consciousness, which is why we're talking about free will here, right? I do really have this sense that I'm the author of my actions, right? I just decided to do this. Or did I? There's only so many things I can do over here to make it look like I'm making conscious choices. So I don't know. So I have the sense that I'm the author of my own actions. So this is either true and we have to explain it, or it's an illusion and we have to explain the illusion. William James described the importance of our experience of free will like this. He said, the whole feeling of reality, the whole sting and excitement of our voluntary life depends on our sense that in it things are really being decided from one moment to another, and that it is not the dull rattling off of a chain that was forged innumerable ages ago. This appearance, which makes life and history tingle with such tragic zest, may not be an illusion. So again, illusions are something that are different, not things that don't exist. Maybe, James is saying, this appearance of freedom of the will is not an illusion. It's weird the way he puts this, is it not? Like he's responding to people who are saying it's totally an illusion. Around this time, or shortly, well, really shortly after this, you have Freud, right? Late 19th century, early 20th century. And you know, Freud's a weird dude. What's that? Maybe in his later life. He was way into cocaine at one point. Yeah. And cigars, yeah. Oh yeah, mouth cancer is why he died, yeah. Which, ooh, what a way to go.
I thought he had like a surgery and then like continued to smoke cigars or something, or like continued after like a diagnosis.
I think so, yeah.
Something crazy.
Because I think there was no point.
Yeah.
There was no point. And so he just, I mean, that sucks. That really sucks. But so Freud is an interesting guy, and you know, say what you will about him. Of course, a lot of Freud's psychoanalytic theories, you know, you've probably heard of, right? The Oedipus Complex, the Electra Complex, penis envy, all this stuff that sounds pretty weird to us. And you know, we don't really pay very much attention anymore to any of these theories because they're not very scientific, right? We cannot test them, right? How would you potentially falsify whether somebody was suffering from the Oedipus complex, right? It's unconscious. And by the way, the Oedipus complex is not what you think it is, right? The Oedipus complex is an unconscious thing. A lot of people think it's conscious. The Oedipus complex is named after the myth, or not, it's not a myth, it's a play by Sophocles called Oedipus Tyrannus, you know, Oedipus the king. Anyone know the story?
Yeah.
Oh, everyone knows, right? Yeah. So yeah, you know, Oedipus didn't know that he had killed his father. He didn't know that he was, you know, amorous with his mother. He didn't know that. And when he realizes it, of course, that's when he gouges his own eyes out, right? So it's unconscious. But because all of this is unconscious, how the heck do you test it? You can't. But one thing that Freud was probably right about is that unconscious forces drive our lives far more than we're aware of. Yeah. But we even though we know, right? You think like, oh yeah, my unconscious mind, that's a thing. Even you still have no idea the level of automaticity or, you know, unconscious desires, unconscious, there's even arguments that there can be unconscious emotions, for goodness sake, right? Yeah, I know it sounds weird, but think about it. It could be an emotion that is associated with some kind of trauma, right? Yeah, emotions are supposed to be episodic,
Yeah.
but if you don't allow them to run their course, if you don't process things the right way,
Yeah.
then it can kind of just get shoved into the closet of the unconscious, right?
Like subconsciously process and then the consciousness and how, like what purpose does it serve in processing?
Well, it doesn't. That's what I'm saying. This is a problem. This is stuff not working.
If they would like, if they just really know about them, kind of.
No, we know about them. It's just that we're not aware of the effects that some of these things have on behavior, right? That doesn't mean we can't become aware of them, right? And people who have dealt with, for example, traumatic events, this is why they go to therapy, right? To talk about what happened and to process the emotions consciously. Freud would say, that's integrating your psyche together. That's taking something from the unconscious, which he thought is repressed. Freud thinks that we repress things, but they inevitably return, in dreams or as neuroses. Again, I don't think that's the explanation we want to use today, but the general idea is kind of like, So even where Freud has the details wrong, I think he kind of had the big picture somewhat correct. Like, yeah, there's unconscious stuff and it drives so much of what we do and who we are. And sometimes when we're not aware of it, it can even negatively impact our mental life, our psychical health, right? Or mental health, as we call it today. So anyway, nowadays we talk about the cognitive unconscious. And I think this is something Blackmore talked about in a previous chapter. But let's talk about the brain. This is the really fun part. Okay, so when we carry out a voluntary action, which, if we're talking free will, we've got to be able to do voluntary actions like this. Voluntary action. Where does those, where do actions like that originate? Well, lots of different brain areas, but they all kind of converge in the primary motor cortex, which is kind of like here, kind of across the top of the brain. And it sends signals to your nerves, which send signals to your muscles, and that's how you move. And there are lots of different pathways for different kinds of actions, and there are different pathways for actions caused by external stimuli. So reflex actions occur via different pathways than voluntary actions, right? So if I'm at the doctor's office and somebody whacks my knee with a hammer, that's a different neural pathway than if I decide to flex my wrist, right? But there is a sort of continuum of activity. It's not exactly black and white like this. Think of if you were startled, right? You might jump, but you might also do something conscious, like move your hands somewhere, But anyway, for externally triggered actions, we get activation in the cerebellum and in the premotor cortex. The cerebellum is kind of deep in the brain, part of that lizard brain we were talking about last time. The premotor cortex is sort of like a step before the motor cortex in terms of the direction of information processing, right? For intentional actions, we have activity in a lot of prefrontal areas of the brain. So we're talking about the frontal cortex. So in the supplementary motor area, we have a lot of activity there. This is for the programming of motor plans. Motor plans or motor representations are just the brain's way of telling us to do things, right? Motor representation. The pre-supplementary motor area, there's a lot of activity there. And this could be the source of something that we're going to talk about in a moment called the readiness potential. The anterior cingulate, actions to do with emotions, responding to pain originate here, modulating attention. So if I'm directing my attention like this, looking around, look at my laptop, look over here, probably happening in my anterior cingulate gyrus. And Broca's area, of course. Broca's area is the part of my brain that helps me organize my motor output for when I speak, right? It makes it so that I get the words in the right order. Maybe you've heard of Broca's aphasia. Has anyone heard of Broca's aphasia?
I know I've heard of it before, but I don't remember exactly what it is.
Well, Broca's aphasia, see, aphasia is word salad. It's when we say the wrong words, we get them mixed up. Broca's aphasia is a type of aphasia that occurs due to damage in Broca's area. So I would be thinking the right words, but I wouldn't be saying them. I'd be saying nonsense, right? Kind of crazy. Also, for the selection of action, we have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Oh, one of our students online says her Nana has Broca's aphasia. So you know about from first person experience. Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, I don't want to get too deep into personal medical details, but yeah, so there are other kinds of aphasia, by the way, not just Broca's aphasia. Yeah, she says it's very hard for her and our family. Imagine that. I mean, put yourself in someone's shoes. As I said, like the part of the brain that's putting the sentences together is working. And, you know, if I had Broca's aphasia, I would probably be like, why the heck can't you understand what I'm saying? Because my speech output to me makes sense. But it's that little bit of Broca's area that maybe has some kind of damage. You know, maybe I got hit on the head or something.
I'm gonna be completely honest. The idea of like any kind of like traumatic brain injury that results in someone being like trapped in their own mind is really terrifying to me.
Yeah, so it's true. Yeah. Also for me, like neurodegenerative diseases are scary. Yeah, that's frightening.
It's not sort of off topic, but it's like the movie from the perspective of the future also.
What's it called?
I'm sorry, I forget, but it's basically like it's not in order, kind of like Memento.
I haven't seen the one you're talking about, but I have seen Memento. And yeah.
Are you familiar with Everywhere at the End of Time?
No.
It is a 6-hour-long album that is supposed to simulate what it's like to succumb to it.
Interesting.
It has been described as deeply unsettling to sit through.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Yeah, it's probably scary. I listen to weird music though,
I
so
only listen to bits of it, like cut up, because like I know for a fact I would not be able to sit through it because like I have the experience of watching grandparents slowly kind of like fade through that stuff.
Yeah.
So it's like it's very personal for me, but
likewise.
it is very unsettling.
Yeah. And perhaps evidence for determinism. I mean, when things happen to the brain, there are changes in personality, changes in cognitive function, right? So that seems to imply determinism in some sense, because even if I am a self and I have a self, it still seems to be determined by what's happening here, right? So, okay, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and you know, this is one of those areas that's affected by certain forms of dementia, like Alzheimer's, and also substance abuse. Substance abuse can really mess this part of the brain up. But we know that it's recruited in the selection of action from single unit recording. So single unit recording is where we have very, very, very small recording devices that we can hook up to like individual neurons. And this is mostly done with animals. But we know that by using single unit recording, we can see exactly which groups of neurons are firing when, you know, an animal selects, you know, a certain course of action. Behavioral studies too, of course. For humans, we tend to use things like functional neuroimaging subtraction studies. Basically, you take pictures of the brain, not pictures, but images of the brain, perhaps with, say, functional magnetic resonance imaging, so fMRI. You take a picture of it doing something. So you have one experimental condition, a different experimental condition where you're manipulating whatever variables you're interested in, and you sort of compare all of those together to see what neural areas underwrite what kinds of functions, right? And brain damaged patients like Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage is a very cool illustration of how the self and freedom of the will does seem to be dependent on the brain. He was a 19th century railroad foreman, right? You probably heard of him. You know, so they're working on the railroad. And you had to use explosives, TNT, dynamite, and you had to tamp them down into holes that were drilled with these tamping irons, which are basically really long steel rods, like a spear, if you will.
Yeah, I love 19th century.
Right? Super safe. Definitely safe. So Phineas Gage is working safely, and he, I guess, makes a spark or something, and the explosives detonate and shoots the steel rod through his skull. Yeah.
High explosives and boson confidence.
Yeah.
Best combination.
Well, it was a freak accident. I mean, he was good at his job, right? It was just like, you know, metal on stone, it sparked, I guess, hit the blasting cap and boom. So Phineas Gage has his dorsolateral prefrontal cortex damaged and his personality changes. Before he was kind of like cheerful, friendly. After, it's reported by his friends that he changed. He starts cursing all the time. He's going to South America and hanging out with sex workers all of a sudden. Well, what's he doing? You know, he's immoral now. You know, in the 19th century, they were all like, oh, think of the children. So yeah, and there's some, this has been challenged a little bit. I mean, I think there were some changes in Gage's personality, maybe not as extreme as it's sometimes reported.
Road with it.
Yeah.
At first they were like, oh, he's a little bit different.
I got an excuse now.
Yeah.
He'd be a lot different.
Yeah, exactly. Like why? Maybe it was just the near-death experience, right?
Yeah.
You know, so he's like living life to the fullest. Like, I don't know. So, yeah, Phineas Gage. But when we're talking about, we're not talking about neuroscience. We're talking about the philosophy, right? We're talking about what is the connection between consciousness, agency, and freedom of the will, right? When I decide to do something, it doesn't feel just like neurons firing in my brain. It feels like I've decided to do a certain thing. So I've decided to do X. I've decided not to do Y, and so on and so forth. So really, this gets us back to a question we asked in chapter 3, and that is, what role, if any, what causal role does consciousness play in our mental lives, right? My experience that I am the author of my actions could indicate that I actually am an agent. I actually am in charge and can do what I want. Or it might mean that consciousness is epiphenomenal. Remember epiphenomenalism? My conscious experience is there, but it doesn't play any causal role in anything. It's an illusion. It's like the steam whistle on a locomotive. The steam whistle doesn't do anything to drive the train. It's only something that we can have because the train is running, right? Consciousness might be like that. Like, sure, I have it, but when I go, oh, I'm going to take a sip of coffee now, that's an illusion. It's a trick my brain's playing on me. Maybe. One person who tried to get to the bottom of this was Benjamin Libet. And Benjamin Libet was a neuroscientist, and he wrote this paper, Unconscious Cerebral Initiative and the Role of Conscious Will in Voluntary Action. It's one of the most influential papers on freedom of the will, written in 1985. And he used a very interesting finding to get this research going. He used the readiness potential. Voluntary actions are preceded by what we call a readiness potential. And we've known this since the 1960s, rather. What we do is we put an EEG cap on you. You've all seen those, right? They have lots of little electrodes, and you put like saline water on them, and you put the person in the Faraday cage or a room with no electricity, and you have them do the experiment, or actually quite commonly, this is used for medical diagnoses too. Like you probably see this used more if you're going in and getting assessed for like epilepsy or something, you will probably have an EEG scan done, right? But we still use them for some research. And we've known about this readiness potential. What is the readiness potential? The readiness potential, which we've known about since the 60s, is a slow negative shift in electrical potential. Because remember, the brain is sending electrical signals all over the place all the time when neurons fire. And in groups of neurons in the cortex near the scalp, we can record these changes in electrical potential. We can record the voltage increasing and decreasing as different areas do different things. So the readiness potential is a slow negative shift in this electrical potential. We record it with our scalp electrodes, and it usually occurs between half a second to 1 second before a consciously initiated action is performed. So if I do this, or raise your hand, right? You raise your hand, the readiness potential appears 500 to 1,000 milliseconds, and averages about 800 milliseconds before your hand goes up. So you had a question? Maybe, we don't know, because this isn't the only thing going on, right? There's other things happening.
Is this similar to like this theory?
Similar, yeah,
Okay.
similar. So Libet started to wonder, because he knew about the readiness potential, right? He was like, what comes first? Does my conscious awareness of my voluntary urge to raise my hand come before the readiness potential? Or does the readiness potential come first? Remember, the readiness potential is unconscious. The readiness potential might come first, followed by my urge to raise my hand, right? Which comes first? They're not, it turns out. Libet figured this out. He did a really, really clever experiment. He thought that if conscious intention is what initiates the action, raising a hand or flexing the wrist, then the subjective experience of intending to raise your hand or flex your wrist should happen before or at the same time as the readiness potential, right? So Libet had to time 3 different events. He needed to time the initiation of the action, which in this case was just flexing the wrist. And he did that with some galvanometers. They measure the skin conductance, like when you put these on, you know, you're sweating. And sweat is like salt water. It transmits electricity. So when your muscles move, the galvanometer can pick it up. So very easy. We can very easily record when the action begins. And we need to record when the readiness potential begins. Also very easy. The EEG does that, right? And finally, this is the tricky part. We need to time the moment of the conscious decision to act. Libet called this W. So we need to time the action, the readiness potential, and W, the conscious, like, oh, I'll flex my wrist now, right? Right, so as I said, this was easy for the action. He used electrodes. The timing of the readiness potential is, these are all like, when you're doing anything with EEG, it's all like time-locked averages. So you kind of average everything out and you can see exactly when things are happening. Measuring double was done with an oscilloscope. An oscilloscope, you've all seen these. Nowadays, they're digital. They show waves, waveforms, right? Yeah. Back in the day, we had cathode ray oscilloscopes, which had like a circular green screen. And they look maybe a bit like an old radio, right? And Libet would have this spot of light revolving around the screen. And the screen was also marked, a bit like a clock, you know, so there were numbers around, and the participants could just report where the spot was when they experienced, like when they said to themselves, oh, I'll flex my wrist now. So they're watching the circle go around, and maybe it gets 6 o'clock and they're like, I'll move now. So they can just report, oh, when the dot was there, I experienced the voluntary urge to flex my wrist. So that's how they did that. And now Libet, now that he was measuring all these things, he could answer the question, what comes first? The start of the readiness potential or the conscious decision to act? What do you think comes first? Yeah. Yeah. And it came way first, right? It came at 550 milliseconds before the action, and the will to make the action occurred only 200 milliseconds before the action, right?
Okay, but wait a second. So if you're announcing that you're gonna do it, wouldn't that announcement be subject to the same readiness potential as? So,
No, you're not announcing it out loud, right? Because then you would interfere.
yeah.
But you would have to say, you'd have to remember where the clock was.
It's really weird because it's like drawing back the slingshot before knowing you're gonna fire a slingshot. If the readiness potential comes before the like conscious thought.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in that example, it's like, I feel like drawing back in some shot is just like, yeah, you could, that's an action you could do without necessarily knowing what you're going to follow through with.
Yes. And that's going to come in handy later. We'll see. But that is a very good point. But yeah, it's weird, right? Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
You probably you like you think like, yeah, no, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna take right.
So something happening before that.
Something happening before I decide, you know, I'd like some coffee. Something's already happened, right?
Okay. But you perceiving the thought, like, when, okay, so you decide to do something, you perceiving it, and in transit, you're going to have to take a certain amount of time.
Yeah, but it happens very fast. Like this is a long time in terms of neuroscience. Like 500 milliseconds is a long time. The speed of nerve signals is like probably 10, 20 times faster than that.
Oh.
Yeah, so this is a long time. Yeah.
I read this morning, so I forget like the bigger context of this quote, but there was a study that suggested that unnoticed stimuli around you are constantly affecting your motivations.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that is slightly more settling and less unnerving. The fact that there's something that happens before I think I'm going to do something.
Yeah.
Because my brain is already I'm unconsciously perceiving what's around me, what the purpose is, and it only has to it's just one extra shift to move towards that. And then I think about it.
In this trial, right, the participant knows what they're supposed to do. And so that the effect of the RP comes first might just be the brain basically acting on what is already established it might have to do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why it's called the readiness potential, not the all of a sudden I'm going to do something potential, right?
You know, maybe it's like if if someone is holding like a ball and they say that they're going to toss the ball to you, and and then they do like the follow through animation, like the follow through action, and then they hold on to it, you might still flinch.
Yeah.
And catch it because your brain's been primed for that
Yeah,
response.
yeah. I do that to my dog all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, like catch the thing. Ah, no, like
it might be that where it doesn't necessarily like conflict with like the ideas of like before, it just plays into it in a different way.
perhaps. So, okay. Let's discuss, because obviously this has got some wheels turning, right? So let's discuss how we reason our way around this. So the facts are that the readiness potential occurs before the conscious intention is reported. That's not in dispute, right? And this is, again, neurologically speaking, this is a long time. This is not in dispute. So what do? Do we say, oh, I guess we don't have free will if the conscious intention actually happened before the readiness potential? That would be magical. That wouldn't make sense, right? The second is to try to find some sort of remaining causal role for freedom of the will, and that's what Libet decided to do. He said that free will is really just a kind of conscious veto. It allows some actions to proceed, but it stops other actions, right? Some of Libet's participants had even reported that, oh, when the dot was at 9 o'clock, I felt the urge to move, but I stopped myself, right? So free will is not selecting what you do, it's selecting what you will not do. So as Richard Gregory said, Libet's results suggest that we don't have free will, but we do have free won't, right? So the brain has kind of got us on automatic pilot, and what free will is actually the thing that goes and stops you from doing something rather than what makes you do the thing. But that's just for simple action. This is just this.
That would have made a really shitty name for TV.
Yeah. Like free your mind, you know. Yeah. The other thing, like, think about the difference between deciding, like, when do I want to do this, and you're just like trying to make it random. That's very different from, like, where do I want to go for a vacation, right? Deciding where do you go. Do I go to Australia or Iceland? I don't know. Where do I go, right? You got to decide. Do I not go at all? You know, maybe a pandemic happens and you don't go, right? So, yeah, this is the weird part. This is a seance. Yeah, this is a seance. Now we're getting into the experience of freedom of the will. We'll just talk for another 5 minutes or so, and then it's probably time to go. But this is kind of something I also like to talk about in my philosophy of the paranormal class, which I teach sometimes, where we examine pseudoscience versus science. We talk about something called anomalistic psychology, which is sort of an alternative to the attempt at studying the paranormal psychologically known as parapsychology. We also talk about, you know, a lot of the things that we've touched on here: consciousness, metaphysics, epistemology, you know. But the experience of will is related to these kinds of events. This is a spiritualist seance. In the 19th century, spiritualism was at its height. Well, actually, I don't know. Maybe it's actually greater than it's ever been now. But spiritualism was this thing that kicked off in New York in the mid-19th century, thanks to a pair of sisters called the Fox sisters, who claimed to be able to communicate with the spirit of a deceased guy who had lived at their house. What they were actually doing was cracking their knuckles against the board of their bed. They shared a bed, and they have to do the seance in the bed. And they came up with this sort of code, like 1 tap for yes, 2 taps for no. But it was really just, they were popping their joints against the wood, right? But anyway, their claims of being able to communicate with the dead ignited the spiritualist craze, which eventually spread to the United Kingdom. And then that's where you got the Society for Psychical Research. What's that?
Reverse colonialism.
Yeah, kind of, like they went back, all these ideas went, and speaking of colonialism, a lot of this is just straight up appropriated from, you know, lots of different stuff, right? Straight up just, we'll take that, thank you. And, you know, really not cool, you know, like this here is the medium. And she has some strange makeup.
I could have picked that out.
Yeah.
She was very medium.
Yeah, very medium. She looks like she could be in like a black metal band or something, right? Like, that'd be cool. Actually, this would be a good album cover. Yeah. Anyway, so, you know, mediums would do these seances, right? The seance is where you try and contact the spirit of the dead. And this particular kind of seance is called a table turning seance. Now, basically everybody, as you see in the picture, puts their hands on the table. And if the ghosts come, the idea is that they show you they're there by moving the table. The table like rocks like this, right? Now, at the time, we have Michael Faraday, a very famous scientist. He did a lot of public demonstrations with electricity. In fact, he did a lot of studying electricity too. He just didn't, he just wasn't educated in the mathematics that he needed to sort of, you know, formalize the laws of electromagnetism. James Clerk Maxwell would come along later and do that for him. But Faraday was a very good scientist who kind of, his life is kind of a Cinderella story. You know, he grew up very poor and became this famous scientist without even being educated in math. Like nuts. That's
ideal.
Yeah, exactly.
You get the famous science,
You don't have to do any math. Great. So he was like, I suspect something's going on here. The people at the table, they feel like the table's moving on its own. They're not moving it, they say. Right? So it's kind of the reverse of before, like I'm deciding to do this. Well, here we have a table moving and people are like, I'm not doing that. Right? So he came up with an experiment. He had these cards that he could attach to the table with this kind of like rubber cement sort of stuff. So he put the cards on the table with the cement, and then individuals put their hands on the cards. Then they do the seance. And by looking at the patterns on the cement after the experiment was over, he could see whether it was the table that had moved first or the cards that had, or the individual's hands that had moved first. And as he suspected, it was the hands moving the table. But, and this is the weird thing, the people participating in the seance say, well, we don't feel like we're moving the table. It's a ghost, right? But really they were moving the table, but they didn't feel like it. This is called the ideo-motor effect. Yeah.
There was an activity that we used to do at camp where there was like a high jump rod, and then everybody would stand on either side of it.
Huh.
And the camp counselor would just say, this is a helium-filled rod, and everybody would put their fingers underneath it, and the goal would be to try and get it above your heads,
Huh.
or like keep it in a certain range. But just subconsciously, like one half of the group would like go up really fast, and as soon as it would go up, more fingers would go up, and the rod would just like kind of steady itself up. And until like somebody like pointed out like it's really all just in our heads, and we're the ones that are like when you're conscious of it, then it's a lot easier to control it. So
Yeah.
the thing just goes crazy.
Exactly. So it's crazy how we can feel like we are in control of our actions when we're not, like in the case of Libet's experiments, or that we can think that we're not the authors of actions when we are, as in the case of the ideo-motor effect. The same thing is happening with the Ouija board, which is what we'll talk about next time. You know the Ouija board, right? The thing, it's got a planchette and you move it. Same thing. Dowsing, you know, when you, sometimes you have a stick or some rods and you're supposed to be able to find water. The sticks move. Yeah, I know. I'll show you next time. But yeah, dowsing is a form of divination. So it's loosely related to like tarot cards, mediumship. It's tea leaves. It's all the same kind of thing, right? But in dowsing, you have like maybe like a stick shaped like the letter Y, and you hold it, and it's supposed to bend if there's water. But like, where isn't there water? Right? Is the thing. And also it's been shown that it's an ideo-motor response. So today there's still a lot of spiritualism stuff going on. And a lot of that is probably because we have the sense, or certain people have the sense that, you know, things are happening that they're not in control of. You know, people who claim to be mediums will, you know, say, I'm seeing so-and-so, or I'm getting a feeling like this. Well, they're basically using intuition combined with maybe some cold or hot reading techniques. And like, it's not magic, right? Who's the terrible one? Oh, Long Island Medium,
Oh, God.
right? Who else? There's a few, not as many as maybe there were a few years ago. Like I remember in the 90s, you had Miss Cleo on television. Remember Miss Cleo?
No way.
Oh, she was a tarot card reader, and she'd be like, call Miss Cleo and I'll tell you your fortune. And it's like $9.99 per minute. Like, you know, yeah, it's like one of those. So a lot of crazy stuff. Yeah, dowsing. A lot of this is the same stuff that magicians use, which is why back in the day, Harry Houdini would debunk a lot of this sort of stuff. Later, it was James Randi. I think he passed away a few years ago, but James the Amazing Randi, a Canadian magician. He did the straitjacket escape hanging over Niagara Falls. Pretty cool. And then and nowadays, you know, you've got like your Penn and Tellers and people like that who do very much the same thing. Darren Brown does it. He kind of goes up and says like, look, I can do the same thing that this psychic can do, but I'm not saying I'm psychic. So yeah. So we'll talk about this stuff next time, and it's going to all relate more to freedom of the will and, you know, agency, animism, and mistaking when we are and are not the authors of our actions. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So yeah, thanks everyone. I'll see you next time, and have a good weekend. Yeah, thank you. And bye everybody online. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye. Enjoy. See you all next time.